In the spring of 1945, as cherry blossoms fell across the islands of Japan, the greatest armada ever assembled in the Pacific Ocean moved like a steel leviathan toward a speck of coral and limestone that most Americans had never heard of. Okinawa. The name meant nothing to the farm boys from Iowa, the dock workers from Brooklyn, the college students who had traded textbooks for rifles. But it would burn itself into their memories with a heat more terrible than the tropical sun, more indelible than the tattoos some wore on their arms. 1,500 ships stretched across the horizon. So many that sailors joked you could walk from deck to deck all the way to the island without getting your feet wet. 500,000 men. Marines, soldiers, sailors. Prepared for what their commanders promised would be the final stepping stone to Japan itself. Final, perhaps, but at what cost? In the gray belly of a transport ship, Marines sat shoulder to shoulder on metal benches, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the acrid smell of young men's fear. They had survived Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, names that had become synonyms for hell. They had seen friends torn apart by machine gun fire, watched men drown in surf turned red, pulled the dog tags from bodies so mangled they could barely be called human. They were veterans, but even veterans felt their stomachs tighten as General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr.'s words echoed through the cramped spaces below deck. 80% casualties, he had said, for out of every 5 men who hit that beach might not come back. Some looked at their hands, wondering if they would lose them. Others stared at nothing, calculating odds that no mathematics could truly capture. A corporal from Tennessee folded and refolded a letter from his wife, the paper already soft from handling. A private first class, barely 18, vomited quietly into his helmet. No one mocked him. They understood. What they did not understand, what none of them could understand as they approached that deceptively beautiful island with its green hills and white coral beaches, was that the Japanese had prepared something new for them, something worse than anything they had yet encountered. The Imperial Japanese Army had studied every previous American assault, analyzed every tactic, calculated every advantage the Americans possessed in firepower and naval support. And they had devised a counter-strategy born of desperation and a willingness to embrace death that most Americans could scarcely comprehend. There would be no banzai charges on the beaches this time, no suicidal waves of soldiers throwing themselves against American machine guns in the surf. The beaches would be left open, almost welcoming. The trap lay deeper, in the island's interior, where the limestone had been carved by millennia of rain into a labyrinth of caves, ravines, and ridges that the Japanese had transformed into the most sophisticated defensive network the Pacific War had ever seen. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the Japanese 32nd Army, was a man who understood that Japan was losing the war. He knew the Americans would come, knew they would bring their ships and planes and tanks, knew that Japanese industry could not match American production. But he also knew something else, that every day Japan survived was another day for the emperor to exist, another sunrise over Mount Fuji, another moment of honor. If Okinawa could not be held, and it could not, then it must be made so costly that the Americans would think twice, 3 times, 100 times before attempting an invasion of the home islands. The math was simple and terrible. Inflict maximum casualties. Make them bleed. Make them afraid. And perhaps, just perhaps, they would negotiate rather than continue the slaughter. So the Japanese dug. They dug until their hands bled, until picks broke against stone, until they had honeycombed the island's southern half with defensive positions that 100 naval bombardments could not destroy. They positioned artillery in caves that could be rolled out, fired, and pulled back before counter-battery fire could find them. They created overlapping fields of fire where every approach was covered by multiple machine guns. They stockpiled ammunition and rice, preparing for a siege that might last months. They booby-trapped the dead. They fortified ancient tombs. They turned every hill, every draw, every stone wall into a potential kill zone. And they waited. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday, April Fool's Day. The Americans would later call it L-Day. But the cosmic joke was already being prepared. Operation Iceberg began with the largest amphibious assault the Pacific Theater had ever witnessed. At dawn, as the sun burned through the morning haze, the naval bombardment commenced with a fury that shook the earth. Battleships and cruisers pounded the beaches with shells as large as automobiles. Dive bombers screamed down from carrier decks, dropping their payloads on suspected defensive positions. The noise was apocalyptic, a continuous thunder that made men shout to be heard by the person standing next to them. Surely nothing could survive such devastation. Surely the Japanese defenders would be annihilated before the first Marine set foot on sand. The landing craft hit the beaches at 8:30 in the morning. Marines leaped over the sides, rifles held high, expecting the horizontal hail of bullets that had greeted them at Tarawa, the murderous crossfire of Iwo Jima. They braced for death. Instead, they found silence. The beaches were empty. No machine guns chattered from pillboxes. No mortars dropped from the hills. The Marines advanced inland, cautious, confused, almost suspicious of their good fortune. Some made it a mile in the first day. Others pushed 2 miles. By nightfall, 60,000 men were ashore, and casualties had been remarkably light. Letters home that evening were cautiously optimistic. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad. Maybe the Japanese had retreated. Maybe the war really was almost over. They were so terribly wrong. The killing began in earnest when American forces pushed south into the volcanic hills and limestone escarpments where Ushijima's trap was fully set. The island's geography became an enemy as implacable as any human foe. Rain turned the red clay into a slippery nightmare that sucked at boots and bogged down tanks. Ridges rose sharp as knife blades, their slopes too steep for vehicles, their crests bristling with hidden gun positions. The Japanese had given each defensive line poetic names, the Machinado Line, the Shuri Line, but there was nothing poetic about what happened there. Men advanced 100 yards in a day and counted it a victory. Platoons that started the morning with 40 men ended the afternoon with 15. Medics worked until they collapsed, their hands slick with other men's blood, their minds fracturing under the weight of wounds they could not heal. Artillery fell like mechanical rain. The Japanese had registered every approach, every trail, every likely assembly area. American soldiers learned to recognize the whistle of incoming shells by their pitch. High meant it would land long. Low meant hit the dirt and pray. But there was never enough time, never enough cover. The blasts came without warning from caves you couldn't see, guns you couldn't target. Counter-battery fire was useless against an enemy who could wheel his artillery back into a limestone cavern between shots. Frustration mounted. Fear became omnipresent. Men stopped using each other's names. Afraid to make friends they would soon lose. Ted Estridge was a Marine, though the war had begun to make him wonder if he would ever be anything else. He had landed on L Day and pushed south with his unit, surviving day after day through a combination of luck, instinct, and the numbing exhaustion that makes men capable of functioning in conditions that would shatter them if they stopped to think. He had stopped thinking. Thinking was dangerous. Thinking meant imagining the shell with your name on it, the sniper's bullet you'd never hear, the grenade that would roll into your foxhole while you slept. Better to simply exist, moment to moment, following orders, keeping your head down, trying not to look too closely at the things you passed that had once been men. The mortar round that found him came from somewhere in the hills, fired by a Japanese soldier he would never see, never know, never have the chance to hate personally. It simply was a mathematical arc of high explosive that intersected with the spot where Estridge happened to be standing. The world became light and sound and a sensation of being picked up and thrown by a giant, careless hand. He hit the ground without knowing he had left it. His ears rang with a high, pure note that drowned out everything else. He tried to stand and discovered that his legs no longer reliably obeyed his brain. Blood, his blood, was spreading across his uniform in a dark stain that seemed to grow with impossible speed. Someone was screaming, and it took him several seconds to realize it was him. There had been another Marine standing next to him. Had been. The mortar had caught him square, and what remained was not something that could be helped, not something that medics could patch and send to a hospital ship. The man. Estridge couldn't remember his name, could only remember that he had a wife in California and a habit of humming while he cleaned his rifle, was simply gone in every way that mattered. Estridge stared at what was left and felt his mind trying to retreat from reality, to deny what his eyes insisted was true. Hands grabbed him. A corpseman materialized. his face set in the professionally calm expression that medical personnel learned to wear like armor. Morphine plunged into Estridge's thigh, and the pain, which had been a shrieking constant, receded to a dull, distant throb. Voices shouted coordinates, called for stretcher-bearers, demanded covering fire. He was lifted, carried, passed from hand to hand like cargo. The sky wheeled overhead, impossibly blue despite the smoke, despite the war. How could the sky be so beautiful when men were being torn apart beneath it? The evacuation route was a chaos of movement and noise. Jeeps with red crosses painted on their hoods bounced along muddy tracks, their drivers navigating by instinct and prayer. Aid stations overflowed with wounded, doctors performing triage with the cold calculus of who might survive and who was beyond saving. Estridge passed through this machinery of survival in a morphine haze, aware only of being moved, transferred, always moved toward the rear, toward the sea, toward the hospital ships that waited offshore like floating sanctuaries. The hospital ship was a universe unto itself, a world of white sheets and antiseptic smell, and the quiet, efficient movement of Navy nurses who had learned to maintain their composure while dealing with horrors that would haunt them for decades. Estridge lay in a bed, a real bed with a mattress, and felt the gentle rock of the ship beneath him. Safety. He was safe now. The war was behind him, at least for the moment. He could hear it still, the distant rumble of artillery like summer thunder, but it could not reach him here. Around him, other wounded men lay in various states of damage and repair. Some slept. Some stared at the ceiling with eyes that saw things not present. Some would recover and return to duty. Some would go home missing pieces of themselves. All of them, in their own way, had escaped. But the war was not done with them yet. The Kamikaze came without warning, as they always did. Japanese pilots, often barely trained, flying planes held together with determination and welded patches, had transformed themselves into guided missiles fueled by flesh and gasoline and an ideology that made death not just acceptable but honorable. They dove from the sun, making their approach difficult to spot until the last moment. The destroyer nearby, Estridge never learned its name, was their target. The impact was catastrophic. The plane, carrying a bomb and a full fuel load, struck the ship amidships and erupted in a fireball that sent a column of black smoke thousands of feet into the air. Men were vaporized instantly. Others were burned, blasted, thrown into water that was itself on fire as leaked fuel ignited on the surface. The hospital ship became a hospital for the hospital ship's victims. Boats pulled survivors from the water and delivered them to the very ship where men were still being treated for ground combat injuries. The burned sailors came aboard screaming or silent, both equally terrible. Burns were the worst wounds, the ones that made even hardened medics look away. Skin that had been seared away, features melted into unrecognizable masks, the smell of cooked human flesh mixing with the antiseptic and the sea air. Nurses worked with tears streaming down their faces, their professional composure finally cracking under the accumulated weight of suffering. Estridge, immobilized in his bed, could only watch and listen as the organized calm of the hospital transformed into barely controlled chaos. This was Okinawa. Not just the fighting on the ridges but the totality of it. The sea and the land and the air all contested, all deadly. The Kamikazes would sink 36 American ships before the battle ended and damage 368 more. Nearly 5,000 sailors would die in these attacks, more than the entire Marine death toll at Iwo Jima. The ocean itself had become a battlefield, and nowhere was truly safe. On land, the grinding advance continued. The American military machine, vast and inexorable, pushed against Japanese defenses with a determination born of no alternative. There was no way off Okinawa except through it. Every ridge had to be taken, every cave cleared, every defensive position reduced. The names became famous, then infamous. Kakazu Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, Half Moon Hill. Each represented days or weeks of fighting, hundreds or thousands of casualties. Flamethrower teams advanced to cave mouths and poured liquid fire into the darkness, incinerating men who had no chance to surrender even if they wished to. Tanks and infantry coordinated assaults up slopes so steep that soldiers had to pull themselves forward on roots and rocks. Artillery pounded suspected positions until the earth itself seemed to bleed. The Japanese fought with a ferocity that combined tactical sophistication and suicidal courage in equal measure. When American forces finally broke through defensive lines, survivors would launch nighttime counterattacks with samurai swords and bayonets, choosing death in combat over capture. Some attacks were purely kamikaze in nature, waves of soldiers advancing with no hope of success, seeking only to kill as many Americans as possible before being cut down. American soldiers, many of whom had started the war with a certain squeamishness about killing, became efficient killing machines themselves, shooting without hesitation, learning that mercy was a luxury that would get you killed. The psychological toll was immense. Shell shock, what would later be called PTSD, was epidemic. Men developed thousand-yard stares, stopped responding to their names, broke down in tears over minor frustrations. Some shot themselves. Others simply stopped functioning, catatonic with trauma. General Buckner, the man who had warned of 80% casualties, moved among his troops with the kind of bravery or full-heartedness that senior officers of a later era would never be permitted. He visited the front lines regularly, inspecting positions, encouraging men, exposing himself to the same dangers they faced. On June 18th, as the battle entered its final phase, he stood on a forward observation post, watching an artillery barrage hammer Japanese positions. An aide suggested he should wear his helmet. Buckner, in a moment of tragic prescience, put it on. Minutes later, a Japanese 47mm gun, hidden somewhere in the ridges, fired a shell that struck the coral rock near where Buckner stood. The explosion sent razor-sharp fragments of coral and shrapnel in every direction. One piece struck the general in the chest, severing an artery. He died within minutes, the highest-ranking American officer to be killed by enemy fire during the entire war. His death was symbolic in a way that transcended military hierarchy. It demonstrated that in this battle rank meant nothing. Death respected neither experience nor authority. Everyone, from private to general, was vulnerable. The Okinawan civilians were the forgotten victims of this apocalypse. Caught between two armies, neither of which could afford to trust them, they died in numbers that still stagger the imagination. Japanese soldiers used them as human shields, forced them to contribute to defensive construction, and sometimes massacred them when they attempted to surrender to Americans. American artillery and naval gunfire, unable to distinguish between combatants and civilians in the chaos of combat, killed thousands more. Japanese propaganda had convinced many Okinawans that the Americans would torture, rape, and murder anyone they captured. Entire families committed suicide rather than face capture, parents killing their children before killing themselves, leaping from cliffs, detonating grenades. The southern tip of Okinawa became a landscape of mass suicide, a testament to the power of propaganda and the depth of despair. By the time the battle ended, approximately 100,000 Okinawan civilians had died, nearly a third of the island's population. Their deaths are often overshadowed by the military casualties, but they represent a tragedy as profound as any in the war. By late June, organized Japanese resistance was collapsing, though individuals and small groups would continue fighting for weeks. General Ushijima, recognizing that defeat was inevitable, committed ritual suicide on June 22nd, opening his abdomen with a tanto knife while an aide prepared to decapitate him with a sword. It was a samurai's death, carefully choreographed, laden with symbolism about honor and duty. His death marked the unofficial end of the battle, though mopping up operations would continue. 82 days. That was how long the Battle of Okinawa lasted, from the deceptively easy landing on April 1st to the final desperate fighting in late June. 82 days that felt like 82 years to the men who lived through them. When the final accounting was done, when Graves' registration teams had collected the dead and statisticians had tallied the numbers, the scale of the carnage was almost incomprehensible. Approximately 7,500 American soldiers and Marines killed, 5,000 sailors dead in kamikaze attacks, at least 110,000 Japanese soldiers dead, though the actual number was probably higher, as many bodies were never recovered from caves and rubble. 100,000 Okinawan civilians dead. 250,000 human beings killed on an island 60 miles long. The implications of these numbers reached far beyond Okinawa itself. In Washington, President Harry Truman, who had been in office barely 3 months, thrust into power by Franklin Roosevelt's death, studied the casualty reports with growing horror. Military planners were preparing for Operation Downfall, the invasion of mainland Japan, scheduled to begin in November 1945. Initial estimates predicted that taking the Japanese home islands would cost 500,000 American casualties, perhaps more. If Okinawa, a relatively small island with limited strategic importance, had produced such slaughter, what would happen when American forces assaulted Kyushu, with its larger garrison and more fanatical population? What would happen when they tried to take the Tokyo plain? The specter of another Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other haunted American strategic thinking. It was in this context, the nightmare of Okinawa still fresh, the prospect of repeating it on a vastly larger scale looming, that Truman made the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The moral calculus was brutal and simple. Kill hundreds of thousands with 2 bombs, or kill millions in a protracted invasion. The Japanese strategy of inflicting maximum casualties to deter invasion had succeeded in a way. Okinawa had created such fear, such revulsion at the cost of continuing the war, that American leadership was willing to employ a weapon of unprecedented destructiveness to avoid another similar battle. The irony is almost unbearable. The Japanese had planned for Okinawa to demonstrate their resolve, to convince America that invading Japan would be too costly to contemplate. They succeeded in that goal, but the result was not negotiation or conditional surrender. The result was atomic fire over their cities and unconditional surrender within days of the second bomb. Looking back across the decades, Okinawa stands as perhaps the purest distillation of the Pacific War's essential character. A conflict driven by fundamentally different conceptions of honor, duty, and acceptable sacrifice, fought with industrial-age weapons by men on both sides who displayed courage and endured suffering almost beyond human capacity. The veterans who survived carried Okinawa with them for the rest of their lives. They woke at night hearing the whistle of incoming mortars. They flinched at sudden noises. They saw the faces of friends who had died, heard their screams, felt the guilt of survival. Many never spoke of what they had experienced, sensing that people who had not been there could never truly understand. How could you explain to someone that war was not the glory of movies and books, but was instead mud and blood and terror and boredom mixed in proportions that varied from moment to moment? How could you describe watching a friend die and then, minutes later, eating your cold rations because you were hungry and the war did not pause for grief? The island itself recovered as islands do. The scars were buried under new soil, new growth. Today, Okinawa is a popular tourist destination, known for its beaches and its longevity. Its residents live longer than almost any other population on Earth. The caves where men fought and died have been sealed or converted into memorials. The ridges have names on maps, but those names no longer mean what they once meant. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest horrors, of transforming battlefields into peaceful landscapes where children play and lovers walk hand in hand. But beneath the tranquility lies the memory, in the bones still occasionally discovered, in the unexploded ordnance that must be carefully removed, in the stories told by aging veterans whose numbers dwindle with each passing year. Okinawa was a trap, and both sides were caught in it, the Americans by geography and strategic necessity, the Japanese by ideology and desperation, the Okinawan civilians by the simple misfortune of their birthplace. It was the scariest trap in the Pacific not because of any single moment of terror, but because the terror was continuous, unrelenting, inescapable. For 82 days, tens of thousands of human beings existed in a state of perpetual mortal danger, knowing that any moment might be their last, watching friends and comrades and strangers torn apart, wondering when their own number would be called. Some prayed, some cursed, some simply endured because that was all they could do. And when it finally ended, when the guns fell silent and the last bodies were buried, the survivors were left to carry forward a burden that would never entirely lift. The memory of what human beings are capable of doing to each other when nations collide and compassion becomes a casualty as certain as any soldier. That is the legacy of Okinawa, not glory, but survival. Not triumph, but endurance. Not the poetry of war, but its brutal, prosaic truth.